Hey guys, Aaron Cybertron Zhang here, and today I'm really excited to be debuting a new series on my channel called Trainer Tip Tuesdays. In this series, I'm basically going to cover one topic in VGC and tell you a bunch of things that you should know about it and how I personally go about doing things with that topic. So, as you see, today is going to be about Team Preview, which a lot of you guys have been asking about, so I hope you enjoy it. If you do, please leave a like on the video to show your support for this series, and I'd really appreciate also any feedback and suggestions for what topics you want to see covered in the future. But we're just going to kick it off with a pretty highly requested one. Now, I should give you a disclaimer, this isn't going to obviously cover everything about Team Preview. It's going to be a pretty simplified guide, but I just wanted to get one out so you guys know really what goes in my mind when I, am in Team Preview. And I'm planning on doing a more in-depth one with lots of video analysis from previous years of VGC, looking at professional games and whatnot, so we can go further in depth. But I feel like this will be a pretty good guide for those that are starting out in VGC and just kind of want to know, how do I do Team Preview? So let's jump into it. First of all, Team Preview is really important in VGC. Unlike 6v6 where you end up bringing all your Pokemon, and so in that case, choosing your lead is the only really thing you have to worry about. VGC, you have to leave 2 of your Pokemon on the bench, so you can only bring 4 Pokemon despite having 6. And leading well, obviously, as any of you know who play Pokemon, is really big because it can give you a huge advantage right from the beginning, and it can put your opponent in a bad position right away. And that's really important, right? Because you have a lot of pressure right from the beginning, and it's never fun playing from behind, especially when you chose the wrong leads, and that already gets things going. So you want to try to lead as well as possible in any game. Of course, it's also important because if you choose the wrong 4 Pokemon, for example, if you leave behind one that's absolutely essential to the matchup, it will make winning a lot more difficult for you. I can think of a bunch of examples for this, but I guess a big one is, for example, let's say your opponent has a Cresselia and you end up bringing 4 Pokemon, none which have a way to hit Cresselia for super effective or can resist its attacks. Then you're going to be in some trouble. And that's why, especially against bulky Pokemon, most teams have a way to beat the most bulky Pokemon in the format. Keep in mind that Team Preview really is one of the only parts in Pokemon where everything's completely in your control. Once you go into the battle, your opponent has a lot of control in terms of switching. RNG is obvious a thing. So in Team Preview, you get to pick your 4 Pokemon, and that's a pretty big aspect to it. And of course, the time limit is a thing as well, because there actually is a time limit in both, online and in VGC events. So you should really use every second necessary, because if you don't and you choose the wrong Pokemon, you're already playing from behind. And like I said, it's never really fun playing from behind. So this is basically how I go about Team Preview. It's 9 steps, and it may be a bit intimidating, but just bear with me. I really go in this order, and it's pretty quick. You only get less than 2 minutes for Team Preview, so you really have to think on the feet and think quickly. But basically, the very first thing I look at are obviously the 6 Pokemon my opponent has on their team, and then I try to look for a general strategy within that team. For example, is he running a Trick Room team? Because a lot of times it's evident whether it's a Trick Room team when there's a Fake Out user, a Trick Room user, and a bunch of slow Pokemon. Is it a weather team that revolves around Pokemon like Politoed or Charizard, where you have these Pokemon set up the weather and then other Pokemon take advantage of it? Is it a general good stuff team with just really strong Pokemon in like the top 15 of the metagame, like Kangaskhan, Thundurus, Landorus, Sylveon, Heatran, etc.? Or is it a more gimmicky strategy like Perish Trap? A lot of the times you can tell immediately what your opponent's going to be going for based off the Pokemon he or she has in the team. So, you can use that to already start building off what you want to bring. For example, if I see that my opponent has maybe like a more gimmicky team, such as a Perish Trap team, I'm probably going to try to counter a bit more specifically rather than bring Pokemon that are generally good. So then after I see, the strategy my opponent's using, I then try to guess the items and movesets on all the Pokemon. And of course, you're not going to get it right all the time, but it's a good idea. You want to think, okay, what's the most threatening item that my opponent can have, and what are all the possible items that Pokemon can have? Because, once you start thinking about these things, it'll make bringing Pokemon a bit easier. Guessing where the choice items are and where the Citrus Berry is really important. After that, so now I have a good sense of my opponent's team. I look for basically the weaknesses in my opponent's team. What types are they weak to? What Pokemon are they weak to? Are they weak to any types of strategies like speed control? Can I just Thunder Wave everything because my opponent has no way to stop paralysis? If I'm a Spore user, is there a way? Does my opponent have a way to stop Spore? find the biggest holes in your opponent's team, because that's really going to be the way how you beat your opponent, by exploiting his or her weaknesses. And then this is probably the most important point, at least this is how I go about team preview, and of course not everyone does it this way, but for me, I actually find the biggest threat to my opponent's team and pick around that Pokemon. Sometimes it'll be maybe 2 Pokemon, maybe it'll be even 3 Pokemon, but generally I'll have 1 or 2 Pokemon, like, immediately jump out to me, and I say, alright, this Pokemon is going to be the Pokemon that I really have to conserve, because it can give 4 or 5 out of the 6 Pokemon on my opponent's team a lot of trouble, and then, I want to cover that Pokemon's weaknesses. So it's actually very similar to team building in the sense that you build off each one, but that's how I do it. So then, after that, I'm going to look at the biggest threats that my opponent can have to my team. A lot of the times in team preview, you're probably thinking to yourself, wow, I really don't want to go up against that Pokemon, because there are a lot of Pokemon that when matched up against even 2 of your Pokemon can beat it 1-on-2, and that's like the scariest thing. So, you want to find those Pokemon that can give the majority of your team trouble and make sure you bring counters to that. So, once you've considered all of this, then you pick your leads and then the back 2. After that, you look over the 4 Pokemon you've chosen, make sure, it's not too weak to everything, make sure it can cover all the weaknesses and whatnot that your team has. And then finally, remind yourself which Pokemon are most important to the matchup, because these are the Pokemon you're going to want to conserve and protect the most. So, let's take a look. This is an example, very standard looking team. The team on the left is a team I ran into on Road to Ranked, and the team on the right, of course, is the Mega Venusaur team. So, I'm just going to quickly run down on how I go about team preview. If you want more examples, I always talk about how I pick my teams on all the Road to Ranked episodes, so you can really get a good, sense of how I pick my Pokemon. But, let's look at this case. So, I see the Sylveon, Kangaskhan, Landorus, Thundurus, Heatran, and Cresselia, and generally, against these kinds of teams where the Pokemon are more common, it's slightly easier to predict. So, the Kangaskhan, for example, is going to be a Mega Evolution. Lando T, most likely a choice item, maybe Assault Vest, though it could have, like, Focus Sash as well. Sylveon, probably Specs, Pixie Orb, Pixie of Play or Life Orb. Heatran, something like Leftovers, Thundurus, and Cresselia definitely is a recovery item. So, like, immediately when I go into team preview, after maybe the first 10 seconds of looking at my opponent's team, I already know, like, what's coming my way. So, I already know probably most of the sets, and this is why having unconventional sets in Pokemon can really help you out sometimes, because in team preview, your opponent really won't know what to expect. But, in this case, I've identified my opponent's Pokemon and movesets and whatnot. So then I'm going to look for, what Pokemon can give my opponent a lot of trouble. And then immediately I think Terrakion jumps out, right? Because Terrakion beats the Mega Evolution on his team, which is one of the biggest threats. It also hits Thundurus for Rock Slide super effective damage, and close combat can knock out the Heatran. So I think, wow, Terrakion's really good, but what beats Terrakion? Coincidentally, the 3 of my opponent's other Pokemon, in Sylveon, Lando T, and Cresselia. And how nicely does it work out that Bisharp actually manages to beat all 3 of those Pokemon? Terrakion is a Pokemon that doesn't want to get intimidated, so why not pair up Terrakion with Bisharp? If I lead with that, then let's think about all the possibilities. Especially because I have Quick Guard on Terrakion, which is a nice tech move. If he leads with Kangaskhan, Landorus, I can Quick Guard to avoid a Fake Out and just Sucker Punch with the Bisharp. There's really not many leads out there that can really counter that lead. For example, if he leads with Heatran, which threatens Bisharp, Terrakion threatens it with the close combat. So, the synergy here is really important, because you want your Pokemon to help each other out. Whereas, for example, if I led something like Suicune and Gengar, that's a bit scarier, because, first of all, a Thundurus would be really, really threatening to that. Cresselia would be pretty threatening to it as well. And it's the point where, it basically forces me to switch out, whereas Terrakion and Bisharp can put on offensive pressure against anything my opponent has. And of course, this is dependent on your team and your playstyle and whatnot. So, going back into this team preview, I'd probably lead with Terrakion and Bisharp with Venusaur in the back, because Venusaur is really good against the majority of my opponent's team. And for the last one, I'm probably going to keep Heatran out of this one, right? Because my opponent has Landorus T, he's got a Kangaskhan, he's got his own Heatran, I don't really want to deal with that. And Gengar, typically a Pokemon I like to lead with, but it doesn't look like it can do too much here since I'm not leading with it. So Suicune I think actually makes a lot of sense, because Terrakion, Bisharp, and Venusaur can all check Thundurus pretty well. And once Thundurus goes down, Suicune actually matches up very nicely against my opponent's team. So, that's basically the process I would go through in team preview. And of course, if it's a best of 3, things get a bit different, but you want to play as safe as possible in a best of 1 games. So, that is how I would do it in a best of 1, just because it gives me the most amount of options right from the start. And options is important. So, you also have to predict what your opponent will bring when you're in team preview. And, keep in mind, they're also a human being. They will have a very similar thought process to your thought process when in team preview. So he or she will probably be looking for the best Pokemon to bring against your entire team. Try to think from their shoes. Try to identify, what Pokemon they are, going to try to conserve the most because they realize it's the best Pokemon against your team. A lot of the times, especially newer players, they're kind of careless in protecting the biggest threat. So, you want to target down those threats immediately and try to eliminate it. But of course, smart opponents are going to conserve those threats. But just make sure you know what the biggest threats your opponent has are. And in general, it's a bit easier to predict what your opponent can bring if they have, for example, like Mega Evolutions or bulkier Pokemon. Hyper offensive Pokemon are a bit harder to use, but they are brought out when they can sweep through the majority of your team. So if you notice that you're really weak to something like a Life Orb Blaziken or a Spec Sylveon, chances are your opponent's going to bring it, so make sure you have a counter to it, because otherwise it is going to blow through your entire team. So, a couple of examples of popular leads, because the lead matchup, of course, is really important as well. I think leading is really important because it dictates the rest of the game. A lot of the times, people will lead with leads that can set up for the majority of the game, right? So you have prankster users like Thundurus, Whimsicott, Meowstic, Liepard, like in Fake Out, like in Thunder Wave, like in Swagger, Tailwind, etc. Do all those setup moves. Those are really, really popular. It's pretty rare to see one of these behind, like Whimsicott, Meowstic, and Liepard almost always as a lead. Thundurus, it's a bit more offensive, so it typically can stay in the back, but prankster users are very, very popular as leads. Fake Out users are also really common because, they can help the partner set up immediately. So Pokemon like Kangaskhan, Scrafty, Mienshao, all of those. Speed control users are pretty big here too, because speed control really dictates the course of the game. If you can get an Icy Wind off, or a Tailwind off, or a Thunder Wave off, or a Trick Room off in the beginning of the game, you might be able to overwhelm your opponent with offense right away, and it's why we see a lot of the times, the first turn Tailwind play, or the first turn Trick Room play, the Fake Out Trick Room play, or etc. Speed control is really big, and a lot of times you can expect your opponent to lead with one of a speed control user. Intimidate users, Landorus T is the biggest one here. It's also a very common one. Just in general, paired with the Choice Scarf, you can switch out immediately, get a nice Intimidate off, and then bring it back in for the late game. Fast Pokemon that can get KOs are pretty popular when, your team might be a bit frailer, or the opposing team might be a bit frailer. Terrakion, Virizion, both Pokemon I've used, are great because they put on so much offensive pressure against the majority of the metagame. So if your opponent leads incorrectly, you can just, get KOs or predict switch outs or whatnot. But, bulky Pokemon that can help set up are also really popular. The prankster users, some of those, like with the Thundurus, definitely, Meowstic as well, those are bulkier Pokemon that can disrupt your team from the start. I think Suicune and Cresselia are pretty good examples of this as well. Those are Pokemon that can definitely be in the back, of course, but a lot of times your opponent will probably want to lead with it if you don't have any great checks to it, just because bulky Pokemon are difficult to KO and they can help set you up already from the beginning of the game. And then, of course, Pokemon that beat the majority of your team are going to be pretty popular as leads, so, you can use this to your advantage. Those smarter players will typically keep these Pokemon in the back for the late game, knowing you're going to overextend to try to, knock it out in the beginning of the game. So, a bunch of tips that I can offer you from personal experience. When picking your leads, there are basically two options I see. You can either go with the safest option, one that has even matchups against anything your opponent brings. Basically two Pokemon that have such good synergy that regardless of what your opponent brings, like there are very, very few Pokemon in the metagame that can counter them. Or you can actually predict what your opponent might lead with and counter lead more aggressively. For example, a lot of the times, you'll probably predict the more common leads, like, based off my opponent's team, it's very obvious he's going to lead with Kangaskhan, so I don't lead with something that can beat Kangaskhan, like Terrakion. You do run into a bigger risk here, and Pokemon's all about risk and reward, so you really have to consider it, but it can really pay off if you bring the one Pokemon or two Pokemon that like really counter your opponent's leads, and you just completely outpredict what they're going to lead with, because then you have so much momentum going from the start. You have to consider that, but like in a best of one, I typically like to go with the safest option, but then in a best of three, I'll probably switch things up a bit. Of course, you want to make sure that you don't end up bringing 4 Pokemon that are too weak to one Pokemon. I think a pretty good example of this is Spec Sylveon, or just spread moves in general. You don't want to be too weak to Earthquakes, Heat Waves, Hyper Voices, Rock Slides, etc. So make sure you have Pokemon that can resist with, and so that your opponent can't get too much momentum spamming those attacks. You should also remember to conserve the biggest threats to your opponent's team, and this is something I've been stressing over and over again. For example, there are some Pokemon that can just beat the majority of your team or your opponent's team, and then if you lose those too quickly, a lot of the times you'll find yourself in the end game realizing, wow, I really needed that Pokemon, and I can't believe I just got it KO'd immediately from the start. So really consider this. Think about the role of each of your Pokemon, and that goes into the next tip, right? Every Pokemon has a role when you choose it in the battle. I would hope that when you are in team preview, you kind of think to yourself, okay, this Pokemon is meant to really beat these Pokemon. Of course, it can do other things, but it's mainly there to counter, X and Y. So make sure they try to fulfill their role. Don't let them faint too early, because if they do, then you might be missing a very crucial Pokemon and a member that's designed to be other members on your opponent's side. So, I think the best way really to get better at team preview, honestly, is just to practice over and over again. When you practice more and more, you get more familiar with your own team, so you have a, feeling of what you should be leading with, and then you also really get to understand the metagame a bit better. Team preview is just a lot easier when you see the Pokemon and you know what's coming your way. Even if it's unconventional Pokemon, the more you practice, the more you'll run into more unconventional picks, and that way, even when you run into them in real tournaments, you won't have as much of an issue. Definitely learn from your mistakes, because a lot of losses come from improper Pokemon selection and poor lead matchups, as opposed to oh, there was hacks in this game, or I didn't play as well. Like, a lot of the times players actually just lose after team preview, and that shouldn't be don't let that scare you, because you can definitely win regardless of how bad your matchup is. But the reality is, a lot of players will get down because, they're like, oh, I chose the wrong Pokemon, and then they feel like, well, first of all, it hinders you because you have to play out of your mind if, the matchup isn't good. So that's why it's really important to make sure you have a well-rounded team. Sometimes a Pokemon will be really, really good against half your opponent's team and really, really bad against the other half. So once again, this goes back into risk versus reward. Remember, just ask yourself, is it worth bringing this Pokemon? Can I see myself in a position where I can have this Pokemon out against two Pokemon that it beats? Or do you think, is it such a big threat that my opponent's going to end up bringing multiple counters to it? These are things that we really need to be asking yourself. And finally, I think this is probably the most important thing I can offer you, is always, always, always consider the end game, because your opponent will often keep his or her ace in the back to really close up the game. What I mean by this is, like, a lot of the times you'll maybe see 3 Pokemon cycle throughout the course of the match, and then you won't know what the 4th Pokemon is, and that's a very smart tactic, right? Because your opponent is really keeping you on the edge. You don't know what the last Pokemon is, which makes playing a lot harder, makes predicting a lot harder. Just because once you know all 4 of the Pokemon your opponent brought in the game, predicting switches is so much easier. But what I mean by consider the end game is, it goes back into the fact of don't lose your important Pokemon too early, because a lot of times your opponent might actually conserve the best Pokemon for last and use it to clean up the game. I think a pretty good example of this is actually at the 2013 World Championships, where I didn't know what my opponent's last Pokemon was. This was in the top 8 in Game 2, and it was basically his last Pokemon. I knocked out 3 of his Pokemon. I had a Heatran out, and if it was a Scizor or Cresselia, which neither I had seen in the course of the game, I was going to win. If it was a Garchomp, I was going to lose. So I was like, okay, I like my odds here, but my opponent was smart enough to conserve the Garchomp the entire game, knowing I'd have Heatran in the end game. So things like this is what I mean, your opponent a lot of times will be smart and conserve the Pokemon for last, so keep that in mind. But that's basically it. It's not exactly the most nuanced guide for team preview, but I think it gives you a couple of important tips and things to consider. Like I said, I will be actually doing more in-depth analysis of previous VGC games, really. I'm probably going to be looking at how did these top players choose the Pokemon, what they did right, what they did wrong or not. Yeah, and I want to use some actual video footage, but I think this would be a good way to, get your feet wet with team preview and at least try to help you improve. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoyed this series. There are going to be many more videos like this, so if you enjoyed it, please leave a like, give me any constructive criticism, feedback, and whatnot. Anyway, that's it for this one, guys. If you did not watch Road to Rank, definitely go check that out, and I shall see you tomorrow. Alright, peace.